Hey, welcome back. And if you're new here, my name's Christina Kent, and I'm a full-time fine artist based out of San Francisco. And in this video, I wanted to go through my process of painting some flowers plein air, and also talk a little bit about how I feel when a painting just isn't quite working out the way I'd hoped. So with this painting, I'm out in the community garden here. The weather has just been beautiful, and so I've been trying to get out a lot and paint from life, whether it's painting the cityscape, the landscape, or just painting some small flowers like this in the garden. And I think flowers are so fun and interesting to paint, and they're such a great challenge because their petals and the leaves create these really interesting abstract forms. And as someone who really likes to simplify when I'm painting, I like to try to find large shapes and communicate things about light and shadow and I guess you could say I like to try to find some poetry in the simplicity of a scene. For me, painting something as complicated as all of the little leaves and petals in flowers in a garden is a really great challenge. So that's what I set out to focus on with this painting. And so after I put in my brown underpainting, I then decided I would be working on a small panel today. This is a 5-inch by 7-inch panel, so quite small. And I decided I would limit myself to working with a large brush. So I think this brush is, maybe it's a 1/2 inch in width, so it's actually a pretty large brush. And so I decided I would only use that and my palette knife. And my palette knife is relatively large as well. So I thought it would be a really good challenge to try to paint these flowers, which have all of these delicate, small, nuanced shapes with just a large brush and a large palette knife. And so as I usually do with my paintings, I'm going in with the darker colors first. And here it's kind of tricky to make some decisions because one option would be to just lay in one uniform dark tone behind the flowers and then to layer lighter greens on top of that. I decided I wanted to break it up a little bit and put in a dark tone in the lower part of the canvas and then start to put in some lighter greens in the higher part of the picture frame, since it was getting hit by a little bit more sun. And then I thought, okay, I'll kind of mass in those greens as one major shape, and then I'll add some details to that later and bring out some of those details from the foliage to suggest leaves. Then kind of similarly, I go to the flowers themselves. So they are this incredibly bright orange color. And so the parts that are in shadow are a really deep, warm brown. And then we have the parts of the petals that are in light that are still just very, very saturated. And so I'm not really using any white here. I'm mixing brown from my red, my blue, and my yellow. And then for the orange, I'm mostly using red and yellow to just communicate that really saturated color. But already as I'm putting in the shadow part of these flowers, I'm starting to struggle a little bit with the size of the brush because the flowers, and I'm wondering how much detail I want to include, because the flowers have kind of some there's some really slight shadows that are just kind of very understated, but they're very small shapes. And so I'm trying to decide if I want to mass all of that together or if I want to try to get at those really precise, really small shapes. And here also there gets to be a lot of glare on the painting, so I'm going to go more quickly through this part. But basically I start to add in the parts of the flower that are getting hit by the direct sunlight, which are just that really, really bright saturated orange. Once I have the canvas covered in paint, I start to try to get at some of the nuances in the leaves in the background and the petals of the flowers. But at this point, I start to find it to be quite tricky. The round shapes of the leaves are hard to convey because I'm using a palette knife with a straight edge, and also I'm using a flat brush that has a nice straight edge. So I think it makes sense that it was hard for me to simplify the shapes of the leaves. And then I'm also trying to add some darker shadows. So I'm using like the palette knife and the brush to try to bring out some of those dark shadows to give a sense of space. And kind of as I did with my rose painting from the other day, I want to suggest the shapes of the leaves without painting every single leaf, and I feel like I was fairly successful with that in the rose painting. But for whatever reason with this painting, I just had a really hard time finding that balance between defining the shapes that are there and suggesting a greater wholeness, a greater unity through simplification. I also ran into some trouble with the flowers themselves because I wanted to give a sense of the bright sunlight hitting the flowers, and so usually I would add some highlights to the petals, but I found that I had already used such a bright saturated orange that when I went to add highlights, I mixed a bit more yellow into my orange to create some highlights, and they just didn't have the same punch that highlights usually do. I found it really difficult to create that effect of light that I like to convey in my work. And I think maybe part of it is because I'm not so used to painting things that are so saturated in color, like these really bright orange flowers. So I think that might have been part of that. I was a little bit out of my comfort zone there, and in hindsight maybe I could have made the flowers just a bit more muted if I wanted those highlights to stand out, or maybe I could have just kept them saturated as they were, maybe somehow adding more definition with even darker shadows. But I really was kind of struggling with that in this painting. And I wanted to share this because I think it's important to share that not every painting goes according to plan, and sometimes you'll put in a good effort on a painting and try to make things work, and for whatever reason things just won't come together. I think in this painting I struggled a bit. I mean, I had imposed the limitation that I would just use a larger brush and I would just use the large palette knife. And I think that was a really good challenge, and it did get me to simplify the shapes, but I think ultimately it was a big challenge for me. And even though I was able to add some finer marks and details with the palette knife, like getting just little bits of paint on the knife and putting in those sharper edges, for whatever reason it still didn't quite feel like the painting came together. I do kind of like the sense of atmosphere that we're getting here, but I think for me it's a little too much atmosphere. I would like some parts of the painting to just be maybe a little bit tighter, a little bit more clear, and I find that this painting leaned a bit more on the messy side than I would have liked, and I think it feels a bit more flat, like I'm not getting sort of the sense of depth that I usually like to create in my work. It feels a bit flat and a bit unfinished. And I hope that by sharing this, I just want to promote that it's totally fine to have paintings that don't work out. In fact, I think that as painters, we want to be pushing ourselves and we want to be growing. And that means trying new things, getting out of our comfort zone. And that means, sometimes it's not going to work, but sometimes you're going to make something that really surprises you. I think each painting is a learning experience for us. And so if we can just focus on one thing that we learned from the painting process or one thing that we found interesting, then that's a win. So I hope this inspires you to take more risks in your own painting, because I think that failure is just a necessary step on the path to improving. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you liked this video and found it helpful. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below, and as always, a huge shout out to my supporters on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for supporting this channel and making these videos happen. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.